Martha Moxley was just 15 when her laughter lit up the streets of Belhaven on mischief night. By morning, her lifeless body lay under a tree in her backyard, and Thomas and Michael Skakel, the brothers from the powerful family down the road, became names forever linked to a murder cloaked in silence, wealth, and suspicion. On October 30th, 1975, the neighborhood of Belhaven in Greenwich, Connecticut, was alive with the sound of teenage laughter. It was mischief night, a time-honored tradition where kids ran around playing harmless pranks before Halloween. Toilet paper floated in the trees, and shaving cream sprayed across lawns. In this wealthy, gated community, nothing truly dangerous ever happened, or so people thought. Among the teenagers out that night was 15-year-old Martha Moxley, a kind and bright girl who had only recently moved into the neighborhood with her family. Blonde-haired and full of energy, she was adjusting well to her new life and had quickly become popular at school and among the local teens. Martha spent the early evening hanging out with friends and making the rounds to various houses in the neighborhood. One of their stops included the home of the Skakels, a sprawling estate just a few houses away. The Skakel family was wealthy and well-connected. Their name carried influence, partly because of their relation to the Kennedy dynasty. At the center of that household were the Skakel brothers, Thomas, aged 17, and Michael, aged 15. Both were known to be loud, unpredictable, and sometimes troubled, but they were also popular among the local youth. That night, both boys were home, and the group of teenagers, including Martha, gathered in and around the Skakel residence. Witnesses later said that Martha spent time with Thomas on the lawn, laughing and flirting. They seemed comfortable with each other. But as the night wore on, the group began to drift apart. By around 9:30 p.m., most of the kids were heading home, including Martha. According to Thomas, that was the last time he saw her. He said she left to walk back to her house, just a few hundred feet away. Michael, meanwhile, claimed he left around the same time to visit a cousin's house. Both boys had stories, but no one could confirm where Martha went or what really happened next. The following morning, the illusion of safety in Belhaven shattered. When Martha didn't come home that night, her family assumed she had stayed over at a friend's house. But as the sun rose and she still hadn't appeared, worry set in. Her mother began calling around, but no one had seen Martha since the night before. It wasn't until later that morning, as a family member searched the backyard, that her body was discovered beneath a large pine tree. She had been savagely beaten. A broken golf club, splintered into pieces, lay nearby. The blows to her head were fatal, and it was clear this was not an accident or random act. Police quickly arrived, and as they began their investigation, they made an unsettling discovery. The golf club used in the attack came from a set owned by the Skakel family. What had begun as an innocent night of Halloween fun had ended in a brutal personal killing. The neighborhood was stunned, and a shadow settled over Belhaven. Behind the gates and grand homes, something terrible had happened, and everyone wanted answers. The murder of Martha Moxley sent shockwaves through the quiet and privileged community of Belhaven. In a neighborhood where gates and wealth were thought to offer protection, the violent death of a 15-year-old girl shattered the illusion of safety. Police immediately began their investigation, but from the very start, they were met with challenges. Belhaven was not an easy place to question people. Families were private, powerful, and often unwilling to speak openly, especially when it became clear that the evidence pointed toward one of their own. The broken golf club found near Martha's body had once belonged to a set kept at the Skakel home. This detail made the Skakel household the focus of attention. Investigators questioned Thomas and Michael Skakel separately. Thomas admitted he had been with Martha that night, sitting and talking on the lawn of his house. He claimed that she left around 9:30 p.m. to walk home, and that was the last time he saw her. Michael, on the other hand, gave a story that didn't quite line up. He said he had gone to his cousin's house later that evening and returned home afterward. But there were gaps in his timeline, and his behavior was described by some as strange in the days following the murder. Still, despite the inconsistencies, police had no physical evidence tying either brother to the crime. DNA testing was not yet advanced, and the crime scene had already been compromised. The Skakel family hired lawyers and private investigators almost immediately, and the brothers were protected from further questioning. No one was arrested, and the investigation quickly began to stall. Martha's friends at school were stunned and afraid. They couldn't understand how someone so full of life could be taken so violently. Rumors began to spread among students and parents, whispers that Thomas and Michael knew more than they were saying. But without solid proof or a confession, the case began to fade from the spotlight. The media covered it heavily in the beginning, but interest slowly declined as months passed with no arrests. Behind the scenes, investigators tried to gather more evidence, but most leads went nowhere. Belhaven's tight-knit community closed in around itself, protecting its own. Many residents were reluctant to speak out or get involved, especially when it came to the Skakel family, whose wealth and connections gave them power others didn't have. The case grew colder with each passing year, buried under silence, fear, and privilege. Martha's family was left devastated and frustrated. They had lost their daughter and were now watching as the person responsible walked free. Her mother, Dorothy Moxley, continued to push for justice, refusing to let the world forget about what happened. But with no new evidence and no one willing to talk, the case became just another unsolved murder, sitting quietly in the files of a small-town police department. What had started as a tragic crime was now turning into a mystery that looked like it might never be solved. For years, the murder of Martha Moxley remained a cold case, buried under layers of silence, privilege, and time. The residents of Belhaven moved on, and while whispers about the Skakel family never fully disappeared, no one was ever charged. The case sat dormant until the 1990s, when a surprising new development reignited interest. The Skakel family, determined to clear their name and end the suspicion that had followed them for decades, hired their own team of private investigators. But instead of proving their innocence, the investigation opened up a trail of unsettling information that had never been revealed to the police. These private investigators began interviewing people who had worked in the Skakel home, including tutors, housekeepers, and acquaintances. One former live-in tutor, in particular, came forward with claims that changed everything. He alleged that Michael Skakel had confessed to him during a private conversation years earlier. According to the tutor, Michael had said he was near Martha's house on the night of her murder. He admitted to climbing a tree outside her window and watching her. He described feelings of rage and confusion and claimed he couldn't remember everything that happened afterward. It was not a direct confession, but it was close enough to raise serious questions. This revelation gave law enforcement the push. They needed to reopen the case. Detectives re-examined old files, reviewed prior statements, and tracked down people who might have been too afraid or too young to speak back then. Some of the teenagers who had been present that night were now adults willing to say more than they had before. A few remembered Michael acting strangely, even boastfully, after Martha's death. Others recalled how the Skakel brothers were treated differently by law enforcement and the media, shielded from scrutiny in ways that no one else would have. Investigators also uncovered inconsistencies in Michael's original alibi. His claim of being at a cousin's house during the time of the murder could not be fully verified. Even worse, parts of his story had changed slightly over the years. It became clear that either he had forgotten the details, or he had never told the full truth. In a rare and risky move, the state decided to bring the case to a grand jury, even though nearly 25 years had passed since the murder. This was an unusual step, made possible by the gravity of the new testimony and the persistence of Martha's family. In January 2000, the state of Connecticut announced the arrest of Michael Skakel for the murder of Martha Moxley. He was charged as an adult, even though he had been only 15 at the time of the crime. The public was stunned. After decades of speculation, there was finally a name attached to the crime. But even with the arrest, the case was far from closed. The evidence remained circumstantial, based largely on shifting stories and long-forgotten memories. Still, a trial was set, and the world would soon watch as a decades-old mystery made its way into court, dragging with it the weight of lost time and unanswered questions. In 2002, Michael Skakel stood trial for the murder of Martha Moxley, nearly 27 years after her death. The courtroom was filled with journalists, spectators, and family members, all waiting to see whether justice would finally be served. The prosecution faced an uphill battle. There was no physical evidence tying Michael to the crime, no fingerprints, no DNA, no eyewitnesses. But what they did have was a series of disturbing statements he had made over the years, as well as a timeline full of inconsistencies that placed him in close proximity to Martha on the night she was killed. The prosecution argued that Michael, jealous and angry, had followed Martha after she left his house that night. They claimed he had feelings for her, but she had shown interest in his older brother Thomas. Fueled by frustration, he may have lashed out in a violent and uncontrollable moment. They pointed to the broken golf club, which had come from a set owned by the Skakel family. Though the handle was never found, the remaining pieces matched the set. It was a key piece of circumstantial evidence that cast suspicion on someone in the Skakel household. To support their theory, prosecutors relied on testimony from several people who claimed that Michael had confessed or hinted at involvement. One former classmate from a private school said Michael had once told him, "I'm going to get away with murder. I'm a Kennedy, don't you know?" Another witness described Michael as emotionally unstable, known for outbursts and erratic behavior. While some of these witnesses had criminal records or credibility issues, the prosecution argued that together, their accounts painted a clear picture. The defense pushed back hard. They argued that Michael had been unfairly targeted because of his family's name and past. They pointed out that there were no fingerprints, no blood, and no eyewitnesses placing him at the scene of the crime. They suggested that the timeline was uncertain and that the memories of witnesses coming decades after the fact could not be trusted. Michael's lawyers said the prosecution had built a case on gossip and rumours, not on hard evidence. As the trial unfolded, the media followed. Every development, Martha's family sat quietly, hoping for closure after decades of uncertainty. When the jury finally returned with a verdict, the courtroom held its breath. Michael Skakel was found guilty of murder and sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. For many, it felt like justice had finally been done. But for others, the conviction raised serious concerns about fairness and the reliability of the evidence. After the verdict, Michael's legal team began filing appeals, arguing that his original attorney had failed him by not investigating key evidence or calling critical witnesses. Years passed, and the case made its way through various courts. In 2013, After serving over a decade in prison, Michael's conviction was overturned. He was released on bail, and in 2018, the Connecticut Supreme Court vacated the conviction. Altogether, the decision was final. Michael Skakel would not be retried. The case had come full circle, yet still felt unresolved. Today, the murder of Martha Moxley remains one of the most haunting unsolved crimes in American history. Though Michael Skakel was arrested, tried, and convicted, his release, and the later overturning of that conviction left many wondering whether justice had ever truly been served. After decades of investigation, media attention, courtroom drama, and public debate, the most important question still lingers unanswered. Who really killed Martha? Martha's mother, Dorothy Moxley, remained strong through every phase of the case. She fought to keep her daughter's story alive, never backing down even as the legal system wavered. For her, the trial and conviction had brought some measure of peace, but when the ruling was overturned, she was once again left with doubt. Still, she maintained that she believed in Michael's guilt, based on the evidence presented and the behavior he had displayed before and after the murder. Public opinion became sharply divided. Some believed that Michael had been wrongfully convicted, that he was a teenager with personal struggles who became the target of an emotionally driven case without solid proof. Others believed he had used his family's influence and wealth to escape justice, and that the original verdict had been the right one. The legal decision to throw out the conviction focused not on his innocence or guilt, but on the belief that he had not received a fair trial. That distinction left many feeling uneasy. In the years since his release, no new suspects have been seriously investigated, and no additional arrests have been made. The Skakel family has remained largely silent, choosing not to speak publicly about the case in detail. The once vibrant neighborhood of Belle Haven continues to carry the weight of what happened on that October night in 1975. The tree under which Martha was found has long been removed, but the memories of that tragedy still hang in the air. Despite modern forensic advancements, the case remains trapped in the limitations of its original investigation. At the time, evidence was not collected or preserved in the way it would be today. Witnesses have aged, memories have faded, and crucial moments were lost long ago. Investigators have stated that without a confession or new physical evidence, it's unlikely that the case will ever be fully resolved. What happened to Martha Moxley was more than a crime. It was a wound that never healed, a tragedy made worse by years of uncertainty and legal complications. She was just a young girl walking home through a neighborhood that was supposed to be safe, only to be met with violence and silence. Her story has been told in books, documentaries, and news specials, but behind every version lies a painful truth. Sometimes, even in a world full of evidence and law, answers remain just out of reach. Martha's life was stolen, and the shadow of her death continues to stretch over the community she once called home.